Welcome one more day to Space and Harmonia. If you are watching this video, it's because you are a highly sensitive person or because you have a certain depth and obviously you feel deeper than others. It is not possible to be looking for this type of information and not having a deep sensitivity. So today we are going to see the problematic side of being a highly sensitive person, or even having the condition so-called Asperger. The Aspies are highly sensitive people, even though they are placed within the autistic spectrum, and even though most people within the autistic spectrum are highly sensitive, not every highly sensitive person is autistic, and not even people with traits from the autistic spectrum are regarded as autistic. So, regardless of what you have been diagnosed or what you think you are, this video is going to be very helpful because I'm going to address the main root causes of why we experience sometimes so much mental confusion, depression, certain ailments. And in the last video we saw the common positive traits shared by highly sensitive people and the so-called Aspies. So today we are going to focus on those obscure aspects. If you recall, highly sensitive persons are described with the acronym DAS. Elaine Aron was the one that was bringing this theory into the psychological scope. And DAS stands for deep processing, mental processing, overstimulation, empathic emotional response, and sensitivity. So let's follow these parameters and see what negative aspect is related to them. In the scope of deep mental processing, obviously we have minds that are not only prone to follow patterns or logical structures, they are very good in pattern recognition, but they are also prone to fall into an excess of analysis, and analysis leads to paralysis. It's necessary to analyze situations, but sometimes the mind of a highly sensitive person overanalyzes, and this gets us into a state of stagnation, confusion. We might even make improper decisions, and it's also possible to fall into an excess of judgment. Judgmental minds are very typical in Aspies. They can be very rigid in the way they see things, the lack of flexibility, and it's necessary to relax, to take things easy. Obviously, that's not easy when you have a condition such as Asperger, and that might be an indication a person has that condition, because sometimes it's not easy to find a proper diagnosis. There are many people misdiagnosed, and also many people who having that condition have not been diagnosed with that. There are many masked Aspies out there. Now, there can also be problems with the executive function, and these are a collection of psychological processes which are very important to keep the mind and body in health, in a proper functioning, harmonious functioning. One of them is inhibition, the capability of restricting certain passions, temptations, and the problem with highly sensitive minds and also minds within the autistic spectrum is that there can be moments in which the lack of inhibition is very strong. A person might feel drawn to certain addictions, passions, because there is compulsivity. There can be an OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. This is not necessarily the case, but There is a tendency to have that. And there is also a tendency to have ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and hyperactivity, or ADD, attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity. Actually, this is related to another aspect of the executive function, which is initiation, the capacity to start something which is important, a task. And people with a highly sensitive mind might feel distracted very easily by anything, and they can sometimes fall into procrastination. They know they have to do a task, but they start distracting themselves, or their mind gets unfocused, and in many cases they have to use medicines, drugs, to get focused, especially when they are diagnosed with ADHD. But this is a lack of inner development, because the degree of soul development depends on your degree of attention. If you are able to focus for a long period of time, this means you have a very strong mental mind, mental body. If you are lacking this attention and you get dispersed, it might be due to an excess of psychic energy which has not been addressed properly. There can also be a trauma, something which is distracting you. Now, another aspect is the memory. People with highly sensitive minds can have memory loss, not because they lack memory in itself, but because the information is so overwhelming, which is blocking the brain system, so to say. There is a collapse of information, and this makes it difficult to remember certain things. It's like when you are in a stressful situation and you have to remember something and you say, well, I know this, but it doesn't get into my mind. I have it on the tip of my tongue. This is a very common expression. And this happens very often when you have a very strong psyche. There can also be an incapability of picturing images in your mind, also the incapability of organizing your tasks. The person gets somehow untidy, disorganized, and this is a problem. There is another function, which is providing yourself with the necessary materials or actions. I need this to accomplish that. I need to get into contact with that person to speak about this, about that. People with the Aspies condition, or simply highly sensitive people, even though they can be very empathic, they can have problems in providing themselves with the necessary relationships and materials, because the mind is somehow disorganized, too hyperactive, and this has to be addressed, obviously. There can also be a lack in the function of self-monitoring. Some of us got used to self-monitoring because we have been studying ourselves for many years. I remember that more than 20 years ago I started a dream diary, and 1 or 2 years later I started a self-study diary, which I expanded when I began to interact with others, in especially self-study groups, especially in the fourth way psychology. And this helped me a lot, because when I was younger I tend to be a little bit more disorganized, and I didn't know very much the reason of some of my nervous reactions. Now, in these deep processing problems, we can also have certain obsessions with information, with people, with patterns. It's true that this matrix functions with patterns, but we should not get too obsessed with them. We should be very mindful of what happens and recognize patterns, but we should avoid getting into the mental trap of being constantly moved by those patterns. Now, the second aspect in that is overstimulation, which not always is disharmonious, but in many occasions an excess of sensory impressions lead to a chaotic psyche. For instance, a highly sensitive person can feel overwhelmed by certain sounds, textures, and this can lead to serious problems. There can be certain obsessions, trying to avoid certain situations, and sometimes the excess of impressions can lead to a type of sensory processing disorder which has to do with the inability to recognize facial expressions or even people by their face. That's known as prosopagnosia. One thing is to be unable to read certain face expressions. This is very typical in Aspies. They find it difficult to interpret social cues because they don't get certain facial expressions. But there can also be an incapability of recognizing someone by his or her face, and that's known as prosopagnosia. And I would say that highly sensitive people can experience this incapability when they are saturated. Even though the incapability of reading facial expressions or even recognizing people by their face is more typical in Aspies. But, as I say, in many occasions you can feel confused. I remember an occasion in which I went to visit a certain place and many family members were present, my cousins among them, and I had not seen my cousins for a long time. And I saw a girl beside one of my cousins, and I asked him, "Is she your girlfriend, your friend?" And he said, "No, she is my sister." And I started laughing because I recognized in the moment that she was Sarah, one of my cousins. And I felt very strange because I could have recognized her face, but at that moment I was saturated. I was receiving many impressions, and I think this was the cause of a sensory processing dysfunction in the moment. This doesn't mean I am not able to recognize faces normally, but it's not the first time. So this means that when you are highly sensitive, you can have problems in making sense of the world because all the impressions are coming all at once and there is mental chaos. There can also be an excess of imagination, overstimulation by daydreaming fantasies. This is very common in highly sensitive persons in general. Some of us have such a strong mind that we can get lost in the worlds of pure imagination. And imagination is very dangerous. It is the origin of many of the problems because you can imagine things that are not going to happen. They might be very negative and they put you in a very negative state, stressful responses, and it's necessary to put your feet in the ground, something for which it's very important to feel the body, feel without fear, and relax. This is something I learned from the fourth way psychology, not only by self-studying but working with others. The process of sensing your body and relaxing, harmonizing mind, heart and body is very much emphasized in these self-study groups. Because when you harmonize mind and body, it's more difficult to have these sensory processing disorders. And as I said, imagination can be very dangerous. It doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important for creativity, but it needs a certain harmonization. This is even known in Kabbalistic circles. The union of the Firth, the Sun, and Yesod, the Moon. When the mental sun, so to say, illumines the aspect of the imagination which is associated with the moon. Now, when you don't process your sensory impressions properly, you can also experience certain clumsiness in moving. There can be motor dyspraxia. This is very typical in autistic people. They are very clumsy or find it difficult to perform certain physical actions because there is a collapse of sensory information. So it doesn't mean they are not able to walk properly or move with certain abilities. They can, but it's necessary to harmonize all those impressions. In any case, it's not bad to be unable to walk properly because the brain functions in a certain way. Now, the third aspect is the emotional empathic response. When you have an excess of emotional sensitivity, you can have empathic responses, and this is very typical in highly sensitive persons. Even Aspies or people within the autistic spectrum in general. It's not true, they are not empathic. There is a very big myth which separates highly sensitive people, highly empathic people from autistic people, and this is a big mistake. Hans Asperger was the one that called some of the autistic children autistic psychopaths, something which is an aberration. And it's ironical because some of those people, especially Nazis, were psychopaths themselves because of the things they did. And many of the labels used by psychiatrists and psychologists come from a Nazi context. I think when you are highly sensitive, you are highly empathic, but this can be overwhelming. And in some cases, people can be very introverted because they feel afraid of being hurt, of being overwhelmed by situations that are not easy to process. When someone is introverted or feels blocked in any situation, it can be due to a trauma, to an overwhelming situation that is difficult to process. But this doesn't mean they are not empathic. For instance, I feel very much the pain and suffering of others. But in the past, I was extremely introverted, and sometimes I felt blocked, completely blocked in situations that maybe required a certain help from my part. But over the years, I learned to relax, to process the situations. So if you are a highly sensitive person and you feel blocked in certain situations, you can bring more awareness to your being. If you are an Aspie, this might be more difficult, but this doesn't mean there cannot be an harmonization. I think Aspies came to bring different perspectives, and I'm going to speak more about this because Master Issue told a secret about the so-called people with disabilities. In John 9, you find a very good example. But I leave this for the following day. Now, it's also interesting to see that when you open the heart and you are a highly sensitive person, then you become extremely loving. And this is when you can help the world much more. But obviously, going to the last aspect, there is an oversensitivity. When you are a highly sensitive person, you are going to feel the pain more intensely. And this obviously can lead to fear. You don't want to suffer. And if you see a world which is in chaos, which doesn't make sense, obviously the tendency is to hide. But we have to acknowledge that those of us who have more light didn't come here to hide. We came here to make a change, starting with ourselves. Is this going to annoy many people? Of course. You are going to be attacked. You are going to be hated. You are going to be marginalized. Most of us with light have been attacked and mistreated. But we can overcome that. I assure you this because I experienced very intense situations, and here am I. But in some cases, the pain can be so overwhelming that this can lead to the so-called meltdowns experienced by autistic people mostly. Meltdowns is when you just burst crying or even throwing things or getting into a kind of tantrums, which are not tantrums because in kids tantrums are to manipulate their parents to get something they don't have. But in the so-called autistic community, the meltdowns are more a collapse of their state of being because they cannot process what they are living. Maybe they start screaming in a mall because there is a collection of sounds and smells they cannot stand. So parents should not punish them for doing what they do. It's necessary to be more patient. This does not mean the meltdowns cannot be addressed. They can. For instance, I already told you that I get annoyed when a plane goes over my head. When I'm recording outside, I have to stop. I find the sound of the plane annoying, even though I can stand the sound of the plane when I'm not recording. I have learned to stand many things which are unpleasant to me. This doesn't mean I tolerate all impressions at ease, but I have learned to be more flexible. But there are things that are still annoying to me. For instance, if I play my compositions and after that people start clapping and shouting as in most concerts, I find that very annoying. And most people would think this is not normal because musicians and artists want to be admired. But to me, that's a barbarity because you break the atmosphere of interiorization of peace, serenity. And you can find some traditions in which clapping is not well seen because this scares certain light beings that gather around musicians and so on. So I was not so different from other ways of perceiving the world. I can accept clapping in other contexts, in other types of music, but I don't like with the kind of music I make. And as you know, many people can also experience sheddowns, when the person feels so overwhelmed that they enclose within and they don't want to communicate with anyone. And this can be experienced both by autistic people, by Aspies, and highly sensitive people in general, which are not autistic or Aspie. Obviously, this is running away from the world. We should not run away, but sometimes it's necessary to collect within. I admit that sometimes I don't want to speak with certain people that hurt me. And in some cases, I might shut down at will. I shut up and I don't say anything because silence is a very good way to communicate how you feel with regard to others. So it can be also a strategy. It doesn't mean you are experiencing a disorder. Now within this hypersensitivity, there can also be panic attacks or food sensitivities. this has been very typical in many. I have experienced many food intolerances, allergies, sensitivities, to the point that sometimes I bleeded in the moment by putting, for instance, a piece of bread in my mouth. I no longer experience that because I was somehow harmonizing the way I experience everything. And I have to say that studying the mind of highly sensitive people and autistic people helped me a lot. When I came across the world of Aspies, many things fell into place. This doesn't mean I would be diagnosed with Asperger, but I saw myself mirrored in many of their behaviors. And this is very curious because maybe the line that separates highly sensitive people in general from the autistic spectrum experience is not so strong. I think there are many things to be discovered. Actually, I have already mentioned the ideas of Kazimierz Dabrowski. I think he was probably the best psychiatrist in the last century. And he spoke about the positive disintegration that a person experiences when the person cannot adapt to a world which is psychopathic. And this generates certain confrontations which are expressed in the form of hypersensitivities, in the form of depression, intolerances, skin rashes. And this is very interesting because it can change the way we see certain things that are misdiagnosed or interpreted as autism when maybe they are not autism. This is what Dabrowski said. He said that when someone is highly intelligent, but her personality is not properly harmonized, developed, there are going to be problems of hyperexcitability, and this can be confused with autistic responses. Actually, this is being brought to the light of investigation nowadays, and it's very interesting because many people are diagnosed with autism when maybe they are just highly intelligent and they behave like autistic people because they are overwhelmed, they are incapable of making sense of their experience in a crazy world. And I think this is what happened with many of us. As I said in previous videos, some of us have been experiencing a soul growth, and in this process you need guidance, you need the teaching of issue, the master that brought the harmonious way of growing in life, a life which has been violated, disorganized, has been completely separated from the life source. And this is the reason why we experience disease and death. But we need to reconnect with the true source. So in the next video, I would like to speak more about the divine sense that we can attribute to certain processes, experiences, even disabilities, so that we get rid of the old way of seeing things and open our mind. Even if you have a disability, that doesn't mean you cannot evolve in soul or that you didn't come with a greater purpose. So in the next video, I'm going to bring all this in relation with the teaching of Yeshua. And I also announced that I will bring this type of research into the other channel, Vital in Harmonia. I think it's important. There I will treat the issue in depth, whereas in this channel I will keep expanding the views on different areas. For now, thank you very much for listening with attention. And meanwhile, let's keep harmonizing mind, heart and body to express the love without limits and modified life, integral conscience and deep, blissful serenity.